finally, before I let you go, the Duke and Duchess of York will not be welcome at the royal family Christmas celebrations. The King is said to be keen to keep the pair at arm's length.
It has been a painful week for Prince Andrew. Once a proud figure in the royal family, he now finds himself facing yet another devastating blow that has left even those close to him deeply worried. He looks like a man who has lost everything, a close source whispered. The walls around him seem to be closing in as new troubles rise, pulling him further into loneliness and regret. After years of scandal and silence, this latest heartbreak has left him shaken in ways few could imagine. Stay with us because it might just be his breaking point. The morning the silence broke. The sun rose slowly over Windsor, spilling soft light across the sprawling gardens of Royal Lodge. The air was still, calm, and almost too quiet, as if the world held its breath. Inside the large ivy-draped house, Prince Andrew began another morning that looked just like all the others. The once lively halls stood silent, the laughter that had once echoed through them long faded. Heavy curtains kept the light from entering fully, leaving the rooms wrapped in a dim glow that matched the heaviness in his heart. He moved quietly through the hall, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. There was no rush, no noise, no voice calling his name. His routine had become his comfort, simple, predictable, and painfully still. At the dining table, a silver tray waited. On it, a pot of tea, a slice of toast, and a newspaper folded neatly beside it. The housekeeper had placed them there before leaving him to his solitude. He poured himself a cup, watching the steam rise and disappear. The newspaper lay unopened for a while, as if even the headlines were too heavy to face. When he finally opened it, he didn't really read. His eyes skimmed over the words, seeing but not taking them in. He had grown used to avoiding what was written about him. Over time, the noise of the outside world had become a kind of dull ache, one he had learned to live with. Every sound seemed to echo in that house, the soft ticking of the clock, the faint hum of wind outside the window. Somewhere in the distance a bird sang, but it only made the silence louder. Andrew lifted his cup, but his hands felt heavy. The days stretched endlessly like this, quiet, lonely, and full of thoughts he never shared. He turned toward the window, watching a gardener move across the lawn. The man nodded politely, but Andrew did not wave back. He rarely did. Interaction had become awkward for him. The fewer eyes that looked at him, the better. It was easier to disappear than to be seen and judged. As he stood there, he thought of how different things once were. Grand events, bright uniforms, the sound of applause. Those memories came like ghosts, uninvited yet impossible to silence. He tried to push them away, taking another sip of his tea, but the quiet morning felt heavier than usual, as though something unseen lingered in the air. Then came the sound that broke it, sharp and sudden, the ringing of a phone. He froze. The sound was ordinary, yet in that moment it felt almost violent against the stillness of the house. For a few seconds he simply stared at it, the small device sitting on the table, flashing softly. He did not move right away. Calls had become rare for him. Most who once called had long stopped trying. Slowly he reached for it. His hand trembled slightly as he pressed the green button. "Hello?" His voice was quiet, cautious. There was a pause. The voice on the other end was soft but urgent. Words came slowly, carefully, too carefully. And then he heard it. The news. The kind that doesn't just reach your ears but cuts straight through your chest. His fingers tightened around the phone. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice breaking slightly. The words were repeated, clearer this time, and he felt something inside him crumble. He sank into his chair, his breath shallow. For a moment he didn't speak. The world seemed to stop. The air thickened. The ticking of the clock grew louder until it was the only sound in the room. His cup of tea sat untouched, the steam fading into the stillness. His hand shook as he lowered the phone slowly onto the table. He leaned back, eyes fixed on nothing. His face was pale, his lips pressed tight as if holding back something that refused to stay inside. There were no tears yet, only a heavy silence pressing down on him. Minutes passed before he finally moved. He stood up, pacing the floor in slow, unsteady steps. The same walls that had been his shelter now felt like they were closing in. Every breath hurt, every thought cut deeper. He wanted to believe it wasn't true, that there had been some mistake, that the world wouldn't be so cruel again. but the voice on the phone had been kind, and kind voices never lied about such things. He walked to the window, pushing the curtain aside. The light outside was bright, but it felt wrong, as if the sun itself shouldn't be shining on a day like this. The garden looked just as it always did, but he felt as though he had stepped into another world, one that had suddenly turned cold and unfamiliar. He rested his hand against the glass, his reflection staring back at him. It was a tired face lined with regret, worn by silence and years of public shame. Now another wound had been added, one that no one could see but that he would carry quietly. "Why now?" he whispered, the words trembling out of him. "Haven't I lost enough?" The memory of laughter echoed faintly in his mind, voices from happier years, his mother's warm smile, his daughter's laughter as children running through these same gardens. He could almost hear it again, soft and fleeting before it vanished into the air. He turned away, unable to bear it. The pain sat deep in his chest, sharp and unrelenting. He sank into a chair by the fireplace, staring at the dying embers from the night before. The room was cold, but he didn't notice. The phone still lay on the table, the screen dark now. The words he had heard repeated themselves in his mind over and over, cruel and final. There was no escaping them. The minutes turned to hours, yet he hadn't moved. Only his breathing filled the silence, slow, uneven, almost fragile. The tea had long gone cold. The newspaper lay forgotten, its pages untouched. Outside, the day went on as if nothing had happened. Birds flew across the sky, the gardener worked, life moved forward. But inside Royal Lodge, time stood still. At last, when the clock struck noon, he lifted his head. His eyes were red, his expression empty. He whispered something softly, as if speaking to someone who wasn't there, perhaps to his mother, perhaps to himself. "I tried," he said, his voice breaking. "I really did." Then he fell silent again, staring at the quiet room that had become his only companion. The sunlight had shifted, leaving shadows across the floor, long and dark. The house felt colder now, heavier. And in that stillness, the truth settled around him like dust, silent, final, and deeply cruel. The heartbreaking news had come, and nothing in that quiet home would ever feel the same again. But this isn't the first time he made headlines. Stay with us. When the light began to fade, there was a time when Prince Andrew walked through life with his head held high, the proud son of a beloved queen. The years seemed golden then, filled with duty, charm, and the bright promise of a man who carried both confidence and charisma in equal measure. His uniform gleamed beneath the sunlight, medals shining against his chest, and wherever he went the crowd greeted him with warmth. He had inherited his mother's calm grace, but his energy belonged entirely to him. He was daring, bold, and full of spirit. In his younger days, he often made the Queen smile, that rare, gentle smile only her children could draw from her. "You always find trouble, Andrew," she once told him lightly, and he laughed, saying, "Only the exciting kind, Mummy." He served his country with pride. The Navy had been his escape, his adventure, his way of proving that he could stand on his own beyond the palace walls. He loved the sea, the endless blue, the discipline, the sense of purpose it gave him. His time in uniform shaped him into a man admired by the public, respected by his peers, and deeply loved by his family. For a while, his name meant honor. The newspapers wrote stories about his courage. Crowds cheered when he appeared at events. Even his brothers and sister looked at him with a quiet sense of admiration. He was strong, confident, and free. Those were the bright years, filled with laughter, with family gatherings, and the sound of clinking glasses during royal dinners. The Queen watched him with pride, believing he would carry the family's dignity into the future. But time has a way of changing everything. Slowly, almost quietly, the light around him began to fade. It started with whispers, the kind of murmurs that circle around powerful families. At first, he ignored them. "People will always talk," he said to his aides, brushing it off. But talk grew louder, and the smiles around him grew thinner. Choices once seen as charming now appeared careless. Friends who once stood close began to drift away. His confidence, which had once been admired, started to look like arrogance in the public eye. The press turned sharper, their words colder. Every outing, every friendship, every photograph was judged. The man who had once been celebrated for his bravery was now watched for his mistakes. He tried to carry on, standing tall, appearing at royal events with that same polite smile. But inside he could feel it, the distance between himself and the rest of the family, the quiet judgment in their eyes. Even the corridors of Buckingham Palace seemed to whisper when he passed. When the storm finally broke, it was not with a roar, but with a silence that chilled him to the bone. One evening a call came. It was not unexpected, but it still felt like a blow he couldn't prepare for. He had been asked to step back quietly, gracefully, permanently. He sat there, the phone pressed to his ear, hearing the words that would change everything. "It's for the good of the family," they said. The phrase sounded polite, almost gentle, but it carried the weight of a final goodbye. He didn't speak right away. The words felt heavy, too heavy to answer. The image of his mother came to his mind. The Queen, always composed, always thinking of the crown first. He understood her silence. She loved him, but duty was stronger than blood. When the announcement came, the world reacted fast. Headlines screamed, cameras flashed, and once again he was at the center of attention. But this time for all the wrong reasons. The man who had once been hailed as a hero now became a symbol of scandal. The palace gates stayed closed. There were no public appearances, no handshakes, no royal duties to fill his days. The uniform that had once made him proud hung untouched in the wardrobe. He avoided mirrors, unable to face the man reflected there. His world grew smaller with each passing day. Friends turned into strangers. Invitations stopped coming, and even polite nods became rare. The silence inside Royal Lodge grew thicker, pressing against him like a weight he could not lift. Sometimes he thought of the days when his mother's hand would rest on his shoulder, steady and warm, guiding him back whenever he strayed too far. But she was gone now, and her absence echoed in every corner of the house. He often sat by the window, staring out at the vast gardens that once brought him peace. He remembered running through them as a boy, laughing with his siblings, feeling untouchable. Now he walked those same paths alone, his steps slow and uncertain. The newspapers no longer spoke kindly of him. Even those who had once defended him fell silent. He had become the quiet figure no one wished to mention. Inside, he carried two versions of himself, the proud young prince who had once made his country proud, and the man he had become, trapped by choices that could not be undone. The contrast haunted him. He would look at old photographs and whisper, "What happened to him?" The answer never came, only memories, fragments of laughter, the sound of his mother's voice, the flash of cameras, and the cheers of a crowd that no longer existed. The pain of stepping back wasn't just about losing a title. It was about losing a life, an identity, and the sense of belonging that had once defined him. For a man raised in the center of the world, fading into the shadows was a kind of death. He tried to find peace in simple things, reading, long walks, moments with his daughters. They were his light now, the only reason he smiled at all. When they visited, the house seemed a little warmer, but when they left, the silence returned, heavier than before. Sometimes he stood before the mirror and adjusted the lapel of a suit he rarely wore. He practiced the calm expression that used to charm the world. But now, the man in the reflection looked tired, almost lost. "You used to shine," he would whisper softly, his voice trembling. The fall from grace had not come all at once. It had come slowly, piece by piece, until one morning he woke up and realized the applause had stopped. What remained was the echo of what once was, a life once filled with promise, now reduced to memories. As evening fell over Windsor, the light from the setting sun touched the windows of Royal Lodge, painting them gold for a brief, fleeting moment. He watched it from his chair, knowing that the glow would fade soon, as it always did. He did not move, did not speak. The house around him was silent, the same kind of silence that once followed him out of the palace. But this time he did not fight it. He simply sat there, letting it wrap around him like a heavy cloak, in his mother's quiet light. The house was silent again, the kind of silence that sinks deep into the heart. Prince Andrew sat alone in the drawing room at Royal Lodge, staring at the small framed photograph on the mantel. It was of his mother, Queen Elizabeth II, smiling gently in her familiar way, eyes filled with quiet wisdom. The photograph caught her in the light of her later years, graceful and calm, wearing her favorite pearl necklace. It was the face of the one person who had always seen through the noise of the world and straight into his soul. Every day since her passing, he had felt her absence like a shadow that followed him everywhere. There were moments when he still expected her voice, soft but firm, calling his name, reminding him to hold his head high, to face the world with dignity. But now, there was only silence. The steady rhythm of her life, the calm authority she carried, had vanished. Without her, the world felt colder, heavier, and strangely hollow. He often wondered how she would see him now. Would she still call him her dear boy, the way she used to when he was younger and full of restless energy? Or would her eyes carry the quiet disappointment that had lingered in them toward the end? Not anger, never anger, but sorrow. He could bear many things in life, but the thought of her sadness toward him was unbearable. When he was young, she had been his compass. Her words were never loud, never cruel, but they guided him like a steady light. He had admired her calm strength, her ability to face storms with grace. "Duty first always," she once told him, "but never forget kindness. Kindness outlives duty." Those words had stayed with him for years, though he had not always lived by them. He remembered the long walks they used to take on the Balmoral estate. She would walk slowly, her corgis trotting at her feet, and he would match her pace, listening to her gentle laughter. She spoke little about herself, but everything she said carried meaning. He had always felt safe beside her, as though no matter how dark the world became, her presence would shield him from it. Then came the years when his choices began to cast long shadows. He saw less of her then. Their meetings grew quieter, their conversations shorter, yet every time he entered a room and saw her, something in him softened. Even when he feared judgment, she met him with compassion. "We must face our mistakes, Andrew," she said once, her voice steady. "The crown can forgive, but you must first forgive yourself." Those words had haunted him ever since. He could still picture the last time he saw her. The day was gray and still, the sky hanging low over Windsor. She had been sitting by the window, wrapped in a pale blue shawl, her hands resting neatly on her lap. When he entered the room, she smiled faintly, though her eyes seemed tired. "Sit with me, Andrew," she said, her tone gentle. He sat beside her, uncertain, his heart heavy with everything left unsaid. For a long moment, neither spoke. The silence between them was soft but full of meaning. Finally, she turned to him and said quietly, "You have always been my son, and that will never change." He wanted to speak then, to tell her how sorry he was, how much he wished he could undo the pain he had caused her and the family. But the words wouldn't come. He only nodded, holding her frail hand in his. It was warm and steady, the same hand that had once guided a nation. When he left her that afternoon, he didn't know it would be the last time. The news of her passing reached him days later, and it felt as if the ground beneath him had vanished. He stood in silence for a long time, unable to breathe, unable to believe that the one person who had always been there, steady, forgiving, endlessly patient, was gone. Now, months later, he still found himself walking through the halls of Royal Lodge as if expecting her to appear. Sometimes he could almost hear her footsteps, the faint rustle of her gown, or the low hum of her voice in another room. He would pause, close his eyes, and for a fleeting moment pretend she was near. The photograph on the mantel had become his quiet companion. In the evenings, when the rest of the house was asleep, he would sit in the dim light and talk softly to her memory. He told her things he never dared to say when she was alive, about his regrets, his mistakes, his loneliness. "I should have listened more," he whispered one night, his voice breaking. "I thought I had time. I thought I could fix things." His eyes filled with tears as he looked at her calm face in the photo. "You always believed in me, even when I didn't deserve it. I let you down." The words hung in the air, heavy and fragile. He closed his eyes, and in his mind he could see her smile again, gentle, understanding, full of the grace that had defined her entire life. He remembered her saying once, "No one is beyond redemption, my dear. What matters is how we rise after the fall." Those words echoed now, soft and steady, wrapping around him like the faint warmth of her embrace. He reached out and touched the frame, his fingers trembling slightly. "I miss you," he whispered. "I still need your light." The room stayed silent, but something in him eased. Perhaps it was only memory, or perhaps it was something deeper. The feeling that somewhere, somehow, she had heard him. The pain did not vanish, but it softened, leaving behind a quiet peace. He leaned back in his chair, eyes still on her picture. Outside, the wind stirred through the trees, and the last light of the evening fell across the room, touching the frame with a golden glow. It almost felt like her presence, faint but real, calm but unspoken. And as the shadows deepened, Prince Andrew sat alone, whispering softly into the stillness, "I'll try, Mummy. I'll try to be better." The words trembled in the air, but in his heart they felt like a promise, one made not to the world, but to the woman who had loved him most, and whose shadow he would carry forever. But his relationship with family wasn't close to that of the Queen. How did they treat him? Stick around, a kingdom apart. The great walls of the royal estate stood still, bathed in the dull light of an English afternoon. Behind those walls lived a man once so close to the heart of the monarchy, now quietly fading into its edges. Prince Andrew sat by the window, staring across the gardens that once held laughter and celebration. Everything seemed distant now, even his family. There had been a time when the four royal siblings were inseparable. As children, they shared the same golden halls and the same watchful gaze of their mother, Queen Elizabeth. Charles was the serious one, Anne the fearless spirit, Edward the calm observer, and Andrew, the charming brother who could make them all laugh. But the passing of time and the weight of duty had drawn invisible lines between them. When their mother was alive, her steady hand kept them close. She had a way of softening the edges, making sure no voice went unheard. But without her, the warmth that once bound them began to fade. Their conversations grew shorter, their meetings more formal. What had once been family dinners turned into official gatherings, every smile measured, every word weighed. Prince Andrew often found himself standing apart. Charles, now the king, carried the burden of leadership, and his new role left little space for brotherly talks. Princess Anne, always firm and practical, looked at Andrew with quiet disappointment. Not cruel, but resigned. Edward, the youngest, remained polite, though their exchanges rarely went beyond duty. There were moments when Andrew tried to bridge the silence. He would send messages, hoping to share some simple words of comfort or memory. But answers came slowly, and when they did, they felt cold, as though written by advisors rather than siblings. The warmth of their childhood had long been replaced by a curtain of formality. Camilla's presence only deepened that distance. As queen consort, she carried herself with grace but preferred to keep things professional. When Andrew entered a room, she would greet him with a small nod, polite but cool. The royal advisors followed her example, keeping meetings short, always careful, always proper. It was as if the air itself had grown cautious around him. He understood why. His past still hung like a shadow over every conversation, every family event. There were whispers in the corridors, quiet glances exchanged when his name was mentioned. Though no one spoke of it aloud, he could feel the judgment, soft but sharp, cutting through his pride. Yet amid the silence and distance, two voices never wavered. His daughters, Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie. They were his lifeline, his remaining comfort in a world that had quietly shut its doors on him. Their love was gentle but strong, untouched by scandal or duty. They stood by him when others would not, their loyalty unshaken by the storm around his name. One evening, as rain tapped softly against the windows of Royal Lodge, Andrew sat alone in his study. The fire flickered low and the shadows played across the walls. A knock came, soft, hesitant. When he turned, it was Eugenie, her eyes red, her voice trembling. "Papa," she whispered, stepping closer. "I had to see you." He tried to smile, tried to hide the exhaustion etched into his face. "You shouldn't worry about me, darling," he said, his voice low. But she shook her head, sitting beside him. "How can I not? You look so far away, even when you're here." The words broke something inside him. For a moment he could not speak. His daughter's hand found his, warm and trembling. The silence between them said everything. Beatrice joined soon after, her face pale but determined. She knelt beside her father's chair, her voice steady even as tears welled in her eyes. "We're not leaving you, Papa. No matter what anyone says, you still have us." Andrew looked at his daughters, the only people who still saw him not as a fallen prince, but simply as a father. He reached out, holding their hands tightly as if afraid they too might slip away. "Do you ever wish things were different?" he asked quietly, almost to himself. Eugenie's eyes softened. "We just wish you'd find peace again," she said. "You've carried too much for too long." The room fell silent except for the soft crackle of the fire. Outside, the rain grew heavier, running down the glass like tears. For a long time, none of them spoke. The bond between them was fragile yet unbreakable, built not on titles or duty, but on shared pain and unconditional love. As the night deepened, Andrew's thoughts drifted to his siblings once more. He wondered if they thought of him at all, if Charles, sitting in Buckingham Palace, ever felt the emptiness left behind by distance. He wondered if Anne remembered their laughter as children, or if Edward ever missed the days when they were just brothers, not symbols. But he knew the answers would not come. The crown had a way of separating hearts, of replacing affection with obligation. The family that once stood shoulder to shoulder now lived behind their own walls, bound by protocol more than love. Still, in that quiet room, surrounded by the only two people who had never abandoned him, Prince Andrew found a small spark of warmth. His daughter's tears reminded him that love, though scarred and fragile, still existed. When they finally rose to leave, Eugenie looked back and said softly, "Promise us, Papa. Don't let them take what's left of you." He managed a faint smile, his voice almost breaking. "I'll try." When the door closed, he turned back to the window. The rain had stopped, but the world outside was still gray. He felt the loneliness press against him once more, heavy, familiar, unending. He had once stood in the heart of the royal circle. Now he watched it from afar, like a ghost in his own family. Yet somewhere deep inside, he still hoped for a day when the silence would break, when brothers would speak again, when forgiveness would find its way home. Until then, he remained a prince in name, but a man alone in spirit, holding on to the only love that had never turned away. The storm beyond the gates. The morning light broke gently over Windsor, but inside Royal Lodge the world felt darker than ever. The newspapers arrived at dawn, their headlines harsh and unrelenting. His name was printed in bold again, not for honor, not for service, but for scandal. Prince Andrew sat at the breakfast table, the untouched meal before him growing cold. Outside the palace walls, the storm was raging once more. The papers carried stories that reopened wounds he had tried so hard to close. Old photographs resurfaced, old whispers reignited. Television screens glowed with faces of commentators and critics, dissecting his life like a puzzle they had every right to solve. Online, his name trended again. The words that followed were sharp and cruel. Some spoke of disappointment, others demanded punishment. It seemed that no matter how much time passed, the world refused to forget. "Why can't they just let it go?" he murmured, staring blankly at the folded newspaper. But there was no answer, only the echo of his own voice in the silent room. Royal Lodge, once filled with laughter and the hum of family, now stood in uneasy quiet. The servants moved softly, avoiding eye contact, their pity almost unbearable. Letters came in every day, some sympathetic, some angry. Many he could not bear to open. They sat piled on his desk, sealed reminders of how far he had fallen. Night brought no peace. Sleep eluded him, chased away by thoughts that never stopped. He would lie awake staring at the ceiling, haunted by memories of crowds cheering his name, of a time when he stood proudly beside his mother at parades, the crowd waving flags and shouting his title with joy. Those days felt like a dream now, a dream he had broken with his own hands. The outside world refused to move on, and neither could he. Reporters began appearing near the gates again. Cameras flashed whenever a car left the property. Every movement, every shadow seemed to draw attention. The peace he once hoped to find in Windsor was slipping away. One cold afternoon, seeking a breath of air, he stepped out into the gardens. The sky hung heavy with clouds, and the ground was wet from rain. The paths were empty, the trees swaying gently in the wind. He walked slowly, his hands deep in his coat pockets, his thoughts tangled with regret. He paused near the pond where he used to walk with his daughters when they were little. He could almost hear their laughter echoing through the trees. "Beatrice, Eugenie, careful near the water," he had once called out with a smile. Now the only sound was the rustle of leaves. He looked up at the gray sky, his breath visible in the cold air. Everything he had once been, the prince, the pilot, the charming favorite of the queen, seemed to belong to another man. The titles remained, but the respect had vanished. "Mother," he whispered softly, almost as if the wind could carry his words to her. "I tried, but I failed." A single tear rolled down his cheek, disappearing into the collar of his coat. He turned away from the pond, his steps slow, each one heavier than the last. Inside the lodge, the air was still. The untouched meal from morning still sat on the table. A single lamp glowed faintly beside his chair, the light falling on the unopened letters. He sat down, staring at them as though they might offer forgiveness. The walls seemed to close in, not from grandeur, but from loneliness. The house was full of memories, yet it had never felt so empty. The laughter, the music, the footsteps, all gone, replaced by silence and the faint ticking of a clock. As evening settled, the cameras outside caught the faint flicker of light from his window. Some reporters wondered if he was there at all. Others speculated about his silence, his absence, his isolation. They wrote their stories, but none could see what he truly felt inside, the weight of humiliation pressing against his chest, the quiet ache of a man who had lost his place in the world. He sat there for hours, staring into nothing, the headlines of the morning still echoing in his mind. Every word felt like a wound reopening. Every photograph felt like a reminder that forgiveness was far beyond reach. When midnight came, he rose from his chair and walked back to the window. Outside, the gardens lay in darkness, quiet and still. He pressed his hand against the glass, looking out at the faint outline of Windsor Castle in the distance. Once it had been his world, a place of belonging and pride. Now it was a world that no longer had room for him. "Will they ever remember who I was?" he whispered into the empty room. But the answer never came. Only silence remained, deep, heavy, and unending. And as the first light of dawn crept across the horizon once again, Prince Andrew remained there, trapped between guilt and memory, watching the world move on without him. But something triggered from within. What's that? Let's find out. When silence breaks the heart. The evening sky over Windsor was painted in soft shades of gray when the message came. The house was quiet, too quiet. Prince Andrew sat alone in his study, the fireplace cold, the curtains drawn. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked faintly, counting down to the moment that would break him once again. A soft knock came at the door. One of his aides entered, hesitant and pale, holding an envelope sealed with the royal crest. "Your Royal Highness," the aide said quietly, placing it on the table. Andrew nodded, unable to speak. He already knew what it was. He could feel it, the weight of another loss, another wound to carry. He opened the envelope slowly, his hands trembling. The letter inside was short, formal, and cold. The words blurred as he read them, each one cutting deeper than the last. King Charles had made a final decision, one that would strip him of what little remained of his royal duties. His name would quietly disappear from the last official engagements he had hoped to keep. He dropped the letter onto the table and leaned back, staring into the shadows. For a long moment there was no movement, only the sound of his uneven breathing. Then his eyes filled with tears, real, uncontrollable tears that he could no longer hide. "All gone," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Everything." It was not just the titles or the privileges or the respect, it was his place in the world, the very thing that had once defined him. He thought of his mother, her gentle voice guiding him, her quiet patience when others judged. What would she think now, seeing her son like this, defeated, broken, forgotten? He rose slowly from his chair and walked to the window. Outside, the garden stretched in silence under the fading light. The air was heavy, the wind soft but cold. He pressed a hand against the glass, feeling the chill seep into his skin. Charles had no choice, he murmured to himself, though the words brought no comfort. He's the king now. He must protect the crown. Yet the ache in his chest grew sharper. He remembered the days when they were just brothers, laughing together in the palace gardens, racing horses, teasing each other over dinner. Now there was a wall between them made of duty and disappointment. The tears came again, slower this time, tracing quiet paths down his face. He wiped them away, ashamed, as if the walls might judge him for showing pain. But the loneliness was too much. The silence was too heavy. He walked through the dim halls of Royal Lodge, each step echoing softly. The portraits on the walls stared back, his younger self in uniform, medals gleaming, pride in his eyes. He stopped before one of them, staring for a long time. "What happened to you?" he whispered. "How did it all go so wrong?" His reflection in the glass looked older, smaller, almost unrecognizable. The proud prince had vanished. What remained was a man haunted by mistakes he could not undo, choices he could not escape. Night fell quietly over the estate. One by one, the lights went out. He sat in the dark, the letter still on the table beside him, his hands folded tightly in his lap. The room felt colder with every passing minute. At last, he whispered into the silence, his voice trembling, "I wish I could go back." A glimmer of dawn. The days that followed passed like slow-moving shadows over Windsor. Inside the grand halls of the royal family there was talk, careful, restrained, wrapped in courtesy. Polite concern drifted through official statements, the kind that offered sympathy without warmth. "The Duke is taking time for reflection," one read. Nothing more, nothing less. It was their way of saying everything and nothing at all. The newspapers that once screamed his name now carried new headlines. The world had moved on, but inside Royal Lodge, time had stopped. The house felt heavy, filled with unspoken grief. The silence was constant, no laughter, no footsteps, only the faint ticking of the clock in the hallway. Prince Andrew sat by the window most days, his reflection blurred against the glass. His once proud posture was gone, replaced by quiet exhaustion. The garden beyond, once his place of peace, looked distant now, as though even nature had turned away. His daughters, Beatrice and Eugenie, became his only comfort. They came often, their presence soft but steady. They didn't speak much of the past, they didn't need to. Their eyes said what words could not. One afternoon, Beatrice placed a tray beside him, tea untouched as always. "Papa," she said gently, sitting close, "it's a lovely day outside." He didn't answer, but she continued, her voice trembling with care. "You still have us. Whatever happens, you still have family." Eugenie reached across and took his hand. "You don't have to face it alone." For a moment he looked at them both, the daughters who had never turned away. A small, tired smile flickered across his face. "I know," he whispered. "I just forgot how to live without all of it." The next morning, for the first time in weeks, he drew the curtains open. The sunlight spilled into the room, dust floating gently in the air. It felt strange, too bright, too honest, but it was something real. He stood there for a long time, just breathing. Later, he stepped outside into the gardens. The air was cool and damp, the ground soft beneath his shoes. He walked slowly along the path lined with old trees, their leaves whispering above him. Every step felt uncertain, yet somehow freeing. The world was still there, quiet, patient, waiting for him to return. In the evenings, he sat by the fireplace, staring at an old photograph of himself with his mother. She looked radiant, her eyes full of quiet pride. He traced her face with his finger, his voice barely a whisper. "I'm still here, Mother, trying." There was no audience, no applause, only the soft crackle of the fire. Yet in that small moment, something inside him began to heal, not completely, but enough to breathe again. As dawn approached, he returned to the window. Outside, Windsor lay beneath a pale, golden sky. The first light of morning touched the rooftops, spreading warmth across the mist. His reflection in the glass looked older, softer, a man no longer fighting the world, but learning to live with it. For a long while, he stood there in silence, watching the sunrise. His eyes were tired but peaceful, and for the first time in a long while, he did not hide from the morning. But the story doesn't end here. Watch closely, he might step out sooner than you expect.